So welcome to this new episode of Von Cam, where I will discuss today the Leica Tri Elmar 28-35-50mm lens, also known as MATE for middle angle Tri Elmar, because there's a weight, the wide angle Tri Elmar too, but that's the original one. It's an interesting lens. So here's the hood to protect from solar flares, kind of custom made, well made, but a bit awkward to use. But the lens is just phenomenal, interesting. It's not a zoom lens per se, mainly because it's meant to be used on rangefinder cameras from the M series from Leica. So it's rangefinders usually need to focus. On the viewfinder you have guides, and so basically here you can switch your focal length from 50 to 35 to 28, and you have a nice click when you get there, and that will switch on the viewfinder of your camera the guides. I guess also making a zoom lens compatible with rangefinder would have been really extremely complex in terms of mechanics, inner mechanics, and this one is pretty impressive in terms of inner mechanics. If you look online, you'll find some discussions about the architecture inside the engineering. So it's a 4.0 maximum aperture lens. Kind of not that bright for cameras, for film cameras, but today with modern digital sensors, because you can adapt it, it's actually a pretty good lens, very close to prime lenses. It's basically almost a 3 prime lens. And if you use a digital viewfinder, obviously if you have the rangefinder, traditional rangefinder, you need those clicks to get an idea of your real focus. But on a modern digital viewfinder, you'll be able to preview focus, and you get this extra basically 40mm macro position somewhere here, which lets you do portraits, are quite interesting. I've used it quite a lot now. I'm reviewing it, and I'll show examples a bit later. It's really nice. It's interesting. It's an interesting, it's as usually for Leica lenses, really well built. It's really, the focus is, the sensation, the experience is really great. And surprisingly, I wasn't expecting this, but it's really nice to use. It's really nice to have those 3 focal lengths, and I actually think it's better than the zoom lens, even on my digital SL2, on which I tested it in the M240, because you actually know spontaneously, you know what 28, 35, and 50mm are. And so it's kind of simply like switching lenses, but really fast, and really nice rendering. Let's look at it now. So I was in Heraklion in Crete, which is part of Greece, and took this lens for a spin. I hadn't used it before, and I put it on a Leica M240 body, which is a rangefinder body that has an electronic viewfinder, but I didn't take it. I wanted to try myself at street photography to discover how interesting this lens was. And here we start with full sunlight, very contrasty scenes, and basically it's really easy to use. Actually, on the picture on the right, even so, it's an f4.0 maximum aperture. The bokeh is soft, it's nice, it's aesthetic, it worked great. The color rendering overall is fantastic, as you can see on those 2 photos. The geometry seems great, looks more like 3 prime lenses to me right now. Those 2 next pictures, again, without the electronic viewfinder, you have guides on the rangefinder viewfinder, and that's probably also one of the reasons they didn't make a continuous zoom and chose to have those 3 focal lengths. So it's 28, 35, 50 with the 50mm in the middle position and 28 on the right, 35 on the left. And here it's a 24 megapixel, quite dated electronic body, but it's really comfortable to work with those rangefinder guides. And the rendering, here 2, again, examples in full sunlight, works great. Here again, sunlight, that's the temple of Knossos on the left. The picture on the left, I did some post-processing, just corrected some perspective. Because I actually with this lens, it's really interesting to have those three focal lengths, almost like three prime lenses. There's a slight barrel distortion, and yeah, it can be a bit, at least for someone like me who hadn't used the lens before. I had to correct. That's the only image I corrected geometrically, just to have less perspective. But again, here the color rendering is great. But we can see on the picture on the right, here I would have liked a little bit more depth of field. 4.0 is kind of limiting, but the composition I still had, not talking about the quality of the composition here, but I mean, in that case, I was able to get my composition with this single lens without having to change lenses, and it's so practical, actually. Here again, two photos where I tried to find some really contrasty situations for this old digital sensor. And yeah, here you go, really, you start feeling the limitations of the old sensor more than the lens, actually. And on the right, you can see the grain comes out when I push the low lights. And I can't really push the highlights on this sensor, but limitations of an f4.0 lens, but at the same time, it's very good rendering of colors, contrasts. Again, on those two pictures, under sunlight, strong sunlight conditions with big contrast, works great. The slightly lower light pushed up, the rendering's good. The color is really as in reality, very natural. Looks actually also the use gets really natural. It's really fun to use. I was surprised. I don't like zoom lenses, but actually having those three separate focal lengths makes it feel like really having three usual prime lenses, and you can. It's kind of easier to imagine the composition you're going to do and the field of view you're going to have by knowing it's 28, 35, 50. I actually don't like 28 and 35. I kind of had this lens on 50 most of the time, but felt sometimes the urge to try either 28 or 35. I actually found it useful in terms of the creative process. So yeah, it's the lens, by the way, goes slightly in your view in the viewfinder. So for the wide angle, because the lens is kind of big in terms of those kinds of lenses, if you adapt it on a modern digital viewfinder camera, it's not going to matter. But even so, I sort of forgot about it after a while. Then those pictures have been taken on a few days, but for the sake of the presentation, I tried to go to low light at the end, so the selection is on few days, but I'm going to go to darker situations. So the image on the left, that's sunset. This lens really manages well strong highlights in very contrasty situations. But here I'm really at the limitation of my camera, of the M240, of the sensor. But still, on a scene like the one on the left, the grain is not that worrying in the low lights I had pushed up. But you really start seeing them in slow expositions. I'm at 6,400 ISO on the right, and you really have to, even so I'm probably at half a second there. You really, if you want something with no grain, you will have to go for a more modern sensor. Again, low lights really handles well colors and contrast and punctual highlights, but again on these two pictures, without a proper and stable position, it's going to be pretty hard to take something without grain. On those two pictures also, I had to take many shots before having one that's really in focus, simply because of the dynamic, because of movement artifact. And here I'm going more extreme on those two last pictures. Picture on the left, very dark, lower part of the picture, and a highlight in the middle. The lens really handles well punctual highlights, as you can see on the top right corner of the picture. But then again, if you want to go low light with this f4.0 maximum aperture lens, you have to choose something else. The picture on the right, I found some place where I could put my camera on to have something more stable. Still needed many shots, and this is a 1.5 second exposition. So overall, very fun lens to use. I'm really thinking about using it more often for situations where things can be unexpected and I don't have a project, a photographic project, just doing street photography and kind of vacation photography. Really fun to use. I really would like Leica or some other brands to think about this concept of having a few focal lengths, not a linear zoom with a continuous focal length change, but something like this where you really, in terms of composition and thinking about your compositions, it really changes everything to me. I really found it fun to be able to switch focal lengths and not just go from one into the other in a continuous way. So yeah, great lens if you find one. They're pretty rare, I believe, on the secondhand market, but fantastic lens. Hopefully you found that entertaining. If you have questions or comments, please put them below, and see you next time.